Hello, everyone. My name is Linda Yee, and so I am currently in New York City. I live on the Upper East Side, but I'm actually at my partner's place. I'm in Brooklyn right now. Um, Hopefully, I'm in the most quiet place of the house. But yeah, so I'm a comic artist, and I'm also a food entrepreneur and I guess mental health advocate now. And yeah, and so I write a weekly webcomic called Panda Cup Stories, which is pretty slice of life, and I write a lot about like just what I'm very passionate about, which is like Sichuan food, living with ADHD, and Chinese culture in general. And then this year I actually founded a cooking club called Panda Cub Diner, where I teach my students how to make my favorite kinds of food, which is Sichuan food.
I'm so excited to have you join us, Linda. I also love food. I love hosting. I love all the stuff that comes along with it. And I can very much see now, as I'm diagnosed with ADHD, how that was very exciting to me because you can always be
Yeah.
doing something new. And so I'm so excited to dive into this conversation with you. And just thank you so much for joining us on Refocused together.
Yes, I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for inviting me, Lindsay.
Let's go back to before you were diagnosed and kind of
Mhm.
what were some of the things that were going on or things that you noticed that pushed you to seek out a diagnosis?
Yeah, so I think similar to you, I wasn't diagnosed until I was an adult. So for me, I sought out a diagnosis in my mid 20s, and I was officially diagnosed when I was 25. But I think like growing up, that like I was aware of ADHD, or I guess like ADD at the time, but it was just never something that I really identified with, right? Because like the typical, I guess, like image we have of an ADHD kid is like bouncing off the walls, usually a boy, right? Like being sent out of the classroom for being disruptive, and that was not me at all. Like I was a very quiet kid. I would always be like reading a book under the desk or like doodling. So if I ever got in trouble, it was for something like that. And then I would get this like immense amount of shame for being told off by the teacher because like I was a good kid, right? So yeah, so like I did really well in school growing up, and so I never really had, I think, like problems. But I think like looking back, it was like I was very good at following structures that I was given. So like any time that I veered off a structure is where kind of like things started to fall apart a little bit. So I think like I think like similar to you, things started to get really difficult in college when a lot of that responsibility is up to you. And this might be a little bit of a tangent, but like I sort of realized that there were a lot of things that I veered away from like very strongly. And at the time I was like, I'm just not passionate about this. Like I don't like STEM, I don't like math, I don't like X, Y, and Z. And I think like that's definitely a part of it. Plus, you have the whole like Asian parent like wanting you to be a doctor or engineer, and I was like, no, I want to be an artist. But I think like looking back, there was a lot of like self doubt and also like just knowing without words that like I couldn't hold things in my brain, and I was like, especially I think for a lot of like less creative quote unquote disciplines, there is a certain threshold that you have to make, and just like knowing myself, I was like that, yeah, like I think I didn't even try because I was like, I know I would fail, or that's what I told myself. So basically, kind of my diagnosis came because I was living at home again when I was 24. By that time, I'd like, already gone through 4.5 jobs. It felt like a lot of my peers that I went to university with were, like moving very swimmingly along in their careers. And of course, like that's my perception, right? Everyone has their struggles, but it kind of just felt like I was floundering. And like my latest thing was I had, jumped into creating this like startup, like co-founding a startup with a friend I met when I was working in Beijing. And it was like not an industry. It was a tech startup. I'm not a tech person. And I think we had a really good idea, but then being put in sort of like a co-founder role, I struggled a lot with just like creating structure out of nothing, right? Like even in my other jobs, there were things that like a task I was assigned and then I would problem solve my way out of it. But when it was completely tabula rasa, I just remember like sitting in my dad's like upstairs office, just like zoning out. Anyway, so that startup failed. And yeah, and I think like I was just sort of at a point where I was like, I don't know, is this a quarter life crisis? Like, what am I doing with my life? And honestly, like the thing that really prompted me to get diagnosed was completely random. I was at a bookstore and there was a clearance bin. And there was like a book that I picked up because like the cover was purple and green, which were my like two favorite colors. And then that book happened to be like Fast Minds, how to thrive if you have ADHD or think you might have it. And I like kind of just like sat down and sort of flipped through the book in one sitting and I was like, oh my gosh. And I like probably did a third of the assessments before getting distracted because I don't like filling out forms. But I finally like yeah, just like called and made an appointment and yeah, the rest is history, I guess.
I just got chills because what a moment of like the universe coming together. And like you said, you were attracted to it because it was your favorite colors and you picked it up. It's in the clearance bin. Wow. I just that to me is like it's meant to be. It was meant to be for you to
Yeah.
have that moment.
Hmm. Definitely.
So you go in for the assessment. What do you remember from that time?
Yeah, so the assessment, I just remember it being a series of, I think first I like filled out a questionnaire and then my psychiatrist or the person who saw me went through like a verbal assessment as well. So there was a lot of like, in the past 2 weeks, how often have you had like little to no interest in X, Y, and Z? And I just remember like doing a like every day, like almost every day. And I was like, wow, this, so I think it was like a simultaneous, I felt relieved, but then like I also felt, I don't know, like almost sad in a way. And I guess like talking to other people too, I feel like in terms of being diagnosed as an adult, I did get diagnosed relatively early as an adult. Um, but but yeah, so I think like afterwards, basically they told me they probably thought I had like ADHD combined with anxiety and depression, which I think those comorbidities are very common. And yeah, and like and I started out like on medication basically the week after. And yeah, and it was very kind of I don't know, like life changing. Yeah, I guess it was life changing. So, like I'm on a different like dosage now, but I just remember like I had been working on this, and I remember it very clearly. I didn't get it. It was like a National Geographic fellowship for like visual storytelling, and it was like a week after I had started medication, and I was just sitting there, and I like wrote the essay in one sitting, or at least the draft in one sitting, and I was like holy, like like holy shit, like people do this. Like that would have taken me like 2 weeks. Like I would get started, and after like half a sentence, I'd be like, no, I have to do extra research. And then I would like go off on, and so it was one of those things where it felt like, I don't know, like I had a little bit more control of my brain, or I could see like when I was like having an impulse to do something, and I was like, oh no, wait, let's just like finish writing this sentence first. And yeah, it was just kind of like a moment where I was like, what?
I've definitely had a few of those in the last year and a half. And it is, you're like,
Yeah.
oh, this is what it is like. I get that.
Yeah, yeah, it's like one of those Claritin commercials, right? Where it's like in the beginning they're like, "This is how you see the world," and then like after Claritin, it was not sponsored by Claritin, obviously. Like after this, like Claritin Clear, and it's like they put like a sharper filter on everything, and I'm like, yes, that's like that, but like mentally.
What else have you done besides taking medication? You dove pretty quickly into a diagnosis after finding this book and started on medication the week after. And you've mentioned that it has changed, which is
Yeah.
very common. What else have you done in life that you consider a part of your treatment plan? And I say treatment plan because that can be things like exercise and better sleep habits. It doesn't necessarily
Yeah.
mean something that is prescribed by a doctor.
Yeah, so well, exercise, better sleep habits, still working very actively on getting better at that. But I think like I'm a very strong advocate of like not just being medicated, because like I just personally also saw like, after you get used to your medication, sometimes like effects taper off a little bit, or if I fell into habits that weren't serving me, that would like medication only takes you so far. So I've pretty consistently seen either a therapist or a counselor for at least like twice a month since getting diagnosed. But I would say actually this past year, I've been seeking out a lot more support in terms of like I hired a ADHD coach who was very helpful. So like her method was like instead of like long sessions, because like even when I was seeing my therapist, like we did a lot of like cognitive behavioral therapy, which is very helpful, and I still have kind of a folder of like things that I go back to that she gave me. But I think sometimes it was like we would talk for like an hour and a half, and then I was like, that was a really productive conversation, and then afterwards I'm like, what are we talking about? And like I'll open my phone and like scroll on Instagram or something. And so for my ADHD coach, we'll basically just do like a 15-minute like touch base phone call every day, and then we'll sort of like outline the main priorities of the day. And then I also have a business coach, because like I run my own business, and it's very like similar. It's like someone for me to kind of like sound ideas off of, but then that extra support in either like prioritizing things for me or helping me prioritize things. And I think like just prioritizing is one of the biggest challenges that I have, because like, for us it's like everything is now, and then you have a lot of great ideas, but then kind of that sort of comes back and like bites you in the butt when you feel like you need to do 30 things all like this minute, right? So
Yeah, I'm in the midst of that right now. It's 31
yep.
podcasts in 31 days. No, I very much can relate to all of that. And I'm wondering if you could dive in a little bit more on the connections that you see between the business coach and the ADHD coach, because I think that that is something that is so fascinating because in a sense we are all kind of like the CEO of our own lives, but we
Yeah.
weren't given the skills to get there. We're just like thrown into it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think like there are, oh, I love the way you put that. Like I hadn't thought about it like that. But I'm like, yeah, like we have, I think it's like we have a team of really like excited creatives, but it's like it's a little hard to get everyone on the same page, like in our brains. So I think like the way I sort of see my business coach and my ADHD coach, it's almost like in terms of my business coach, she's much more like helpful in terms of parsing out like ideas, and then helping me figure out like, which of these ideas do I really want to do for my business, like in the next quarter, in the next year, right? Like, and then I think what is really helpful um, with my business coach is she's pretty clear on what like the core mission is. So I think like for me, I want, or like I seek to help, like, whether it be my readers or my students, like enrich their lives with laughter, like more connection to Chinese culture, and food is a big part of it, right? And then kind of like sometimes I lose track of that when a new shining idea like comes, and I'm like, maybe I'll start a TikTok and like do this, right? And so for my business coach, she's very helpful in kind of going like, that is a great idea. How do we bring it back to what you're doing right now? And then what are some like strategic ways that we can pursue this idea while still having a sustainable business? So I think like for me, often like I go with what's new or what's exciting, but from a business perspective, like I also need to be financially sustainable, right? And like it's like, okay, we have this idea, how do we build out the systems behind it that actually make sure that I'm able to like pay my assistant and pay my rent, right? And then I think like for my ADHD coach, it's like everything that makes running a business possible. So like kind of going back to working on like um sleep hygiene and like more consistent and healthy behaviors. And I think like honestly one of the biggest things that I've been working on with her is like um sort of realizing that like rest is also productive. So I have these things like especially in hyper focus where I'll just work for like 20 hours straight, and I'm like, if I stop doing this I'll forget how to do it, so might as well like drink 2 Red Bulls and just like push through, right? And I think like having her support has really helped me kind of like pull back from that a little bit, so it's not all or nothing. Sometimes it still feels hard because like, and I'm sure you like struggle with this as well, where I think the fear is like once you stop, all momentum is lost and then you won't be able to do it again. And I think like I've been working on just like trusting myself more, and then knowing that like, yeah, sure, like it's not that I'm ignoring that that's a problem that I struggle with, but here are some other strategies to help with that, including having someone else be like, remember how excited you were about this, and then like this is the thing that we said like we were going to do. So yeah, just like having someone else, like I think on the other end of the tennis court, like batting a ball back to you, I think just like in and of itself is really helpful.
It's incredibly helpful. That's a great
Mhm.
picture to paint, the tennis game, because I think sometimes we're so in our heads and we get, like you said, distracted by things like starting a TikTok. And I think it's so important in those moments to have somebody remind us what our end game is. And I want to ask you
Mhm.
about this because I feel like we're probably very similar in this. So I have a lot of
Mm,
friends who went into jobs that are very structured in how you get into them. So accountants or
mm,
teachers, like there's a path you take. You do this and then you do that. And then you get into a job and then there's certain promotions that come and there's a path. They
yep,
follow a very specific path. And there is no path when you're an entrepreneur in whatever
yeah,
capacity you want to describe that. Like I don't consider myself an entrepreneur, but I'm building something on my own, which is in a
mhm,
sense an entrepreneur. It's just not a traditional business. And I
yeah,
think it's sometimes really hard because there is no end game. The end game just keeps getting bigger. Like we
yeah,
just we just keep moving the finish line on
yep,
ourselves.
exactly.
So how do you manage some of those feelings when you're constantly
Yeah,
upping the ante, so to speak?
yeah. So I think like a big part of it is also realizing that it's like it's not that I have to wait until I've achieved X to feel like I deserve like to rest or I deserve to like live my life, right? Like so, and for example, like even this week. So like October is also like a very busy month for me as well. Well, it's ADHD awareness month. So I have like all of these like ideas and like things planned. But I'm actually like hosting a dinner party slash birthday party, like PAW party for my 2 cats because like their birthdays are around October.
You
Yes.
are a woman after my own heart. I love that.
Yeah, yeah. So like all the dinner guests, I'm like, if you're feeling gift inclined, please bring a treat or a toy for the kitties, or wine, or both if you're feeling very generous. But I think like looking back, I was like, oh well, I have all of these things to do. Like, do I really, like have time to set aside like a couple of hours to like host and cook? But then I realized that like everything I'm doing like for my business as well is so that I can like live the kind of life that I want to live. And a lot of like, especially in Panda Cup Diner, which is my cooking like membership and club, a lot of like what I also help my students do is like, you know, kind of separate the act of like having to feed ourselves, which is something that's very difficult, I think, for ADHDers with like executive, dysfunction in the kitchen, versus having like food be a really joyful part of your life. And so, hold on, I totally lost track of your question. What was your question?
You
I got distracted by the potty.
No, you said October was really busy for you, and so what you were
Right.
focusing on as far as, like, the finish line.
Yeah. So I think like kind of what I've sort of been what and I wouldn't say like I've mastered this, but basically like I used to just have like the goal, right? Like off into the future, and I would like work as hard as I could to try and get there. Like whether it was like, sacrificing sleep, or just like, being like, don't talk to me, right? Like I don't have time to hang out. Like I need to do like this. And then usually like what happened would be like I hit that benchmark and then I'm really exhausted and I'm burnt out and I end up like binging Netflix for like 2.5 days. Um, and then like you said, right, once you accomplish that goal, it's almost like, okay, like that's over. And then the next goal just appears. And it was just a very kind of exhausting way to live. And I think like now it's like I have that goal, but I think like my underlying, I need to pick a better word other than goal, but like kind of the underlying like thing that I'm also trying to keep in mind is like I want to build from a place of rest and like fun and self-care as well. So I think like yeah, so I think like that's how I'm trying to manage it thus far. I still have like I think issues with productivity. Like I'm very I think like screen addicted, which has also helped like hard because for us I feel like so much of our work is online. But I think like yeah. So I'm like working on also being more efficient with the time that I have. But,
I wanna ask something, I'm curious, because I
mhm.
have the similar scenario of pushing myself to outrageous limits and then
Mm,
crashing and, like you said, the binge of just, like, 2 days
yeah,
of nothing or watching Netflix, and for me, there's always a point of, like, heavy shame that comes in
yeah,
and feeling
absolutely.
really bad about myself, even though rest
Hmm.
is so necessary.
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean the same, and I think it's also just like when rest is not restful, right? Like, and I think like that is usually like what happens when I'm binging, where it's like sometimes I could probably be better served if I just like slept for 12 hours, but instead I'm like up almost like, revenge procrastination, being like, these are all the things I didn't get to do because I was working. And so let me like do these instead. And then, yeah, I think like probably one of the worst feelings is just like being in this state of you're constantly numbing yourself, but you're still aware enough like in your mind that's like this isn't serving me, or this whisper of like you should be doing X, Y, and Z. So yeah, like yeah, that's definitely the case. Yeah, and it's sort of like the more you do it, the almost like deeper you dig yourself a hole. I'm actually like working on a comic about this right now, where it's like sometimes like you feel so empty or burnt out that like you do everything you can to like fill yourself up, and often that's like with food, right? It's with like TV shows, it's with like like for me, reading webtoons, but then it's like you stuff all of this thing in, like all of this stuff in, but then it's not really, it's like it's a reaction. It's not something that's like actually filling you up, and then you're left feeling like worse than ever. And then it's like finding a way to both forgive yourself for that, and then also, yeah, and then like coming out of it.
While we're on the topic of shame, you mentioned something that I actually don't know I've heard anyone mention in the series of interviews that I've been doing for Refocus together, which is the shame of getting yelled at by teachers in
Mm,
school, which was something I, man, the stuff that I held on to. And I have a friend who teaches second grade, and I will tell her some of the things that I would get in trouble for. And she's like, that's it. That's what
mm,
you're holding on to. And you're like, she's like,
yeah,
that was a kid. Like you were a kid.
yeah.
And so I would love it if you would kind of touch on some of that stuff, because I think when we look at ADHD and breaking down the stereotype that you mentioned, this boy who is all over the place and gets sent out into the hallway, there's a reason we were all missed. And it a lot of the times was because we were not talking about what was going on in our heads.
Hmm. Yeah, so I think like I think just like from the very beginning, like a people a people pleasing kid, right? And I think like probably a lot of that has to do with like now I know about rejection sensitivity dysphoria. So like any sort of criticism I would take like very, very to heart. And I think like another part of it is also, so I was born in China, and then my family moved to the States right as I turned 4. So there was also that element of like feeling like I didn't quite belong, like both culturally, and I picked up the language pretty quickly, but sort of like also, yeah. So it was like I think like I grasped like concepts quite quickly. Like like I was the gifted kid or whatever, like one of the gifted and talented kids like growing up. And so it was sort of this like intense feeling of relief and happiness when I was praised, or when, someone was like, like, oh, like your English is excellent, right? Like, I mean, as a kid. Um, and then that was like this feeling of I am accepted, like I am safe. Versus, like when especially like an adult or something expresses like disappointment, or like, oh, you could have done better. Or I think like, yeah, the I think like I remember like the biggest amount of shame was like I had been like praised for being a very good like reader, and then once I had like my book like in the little cubby, like remember the elementary desk, like there were little cubbies, and then like I had like hidden a little book in there and I was like reading. And I think like my it was also second grade, like my second grade like teacher, I don't even remember what she said, but like in my memory it was like the worst thing ever, where like I was discovered, and like I had, um broken this image that I was like the good student, like the good girl. And I just remember like I don't think I ever read under my desk for the rest of the year after that. And it's like one of those things where, and I think that's also one of the reasons why a lot of girls are missed as well, because like there's, like it's, we didn't need a teacher like yelling at us and like putting us out of the room. Like we did that to ourselves, right? So it's like, yeah, like so afraid of being, yeah, like I lost the train of my thought, but like, but yeah, yeah.
When you said we didn't need a teacher to put us out of the room, we did that to ourselves. I just like physically felt that. Like I physically felt
Hmm.
that because that is exactly what we were doing. And I think we were harder on ourselves than any teacher could have ever been.
Hmm. Yeah, for sure.
I'm
um
I'm curious about the cartoons and like the creative side. You mentioned, going to college and the pressure to go into, something science related and kind of rebelling against that because you wanted to be creative. And so I'm curious when you look at
yeah.
how that all started, this love of creating art
Mhm.
and being a storyteller. When did that start? And like, how do you connect that to some of the things you now know about your ADHD?
Yeah, so I mean, gosh, I feel like it started from as early as I could remember. So like I've always loved drawing and I've always loved stories. So like and a lot of it also I carried with me in terms of my immigrant like journey as well, right? Like moving from China to the States as a very young child. Um, and and so I think like, I remember like starting to draw as soon as I could like wrap my hands around like a stubby crayon. And I would always be listening to these audiobooks when I drew because like my parents would just like give me these audio tapes of like the Smurfs, but in Chinese, right? And I think that's still something that I've carried with me to today. So like I consume most of my like reading like via audio, and it's also why I love podcasts so much. But I've actually like thought about it a lot, and I think like I've okay, I'm gonna try and like squish the answer together a little bit. But I think like there are elements of art that I really attached to for a number of different reasons. And I think one of the reasons was praise, which like is something that I didn't really want to admit to myself until like quite recently, where I was able to like recreate quite realistic, right, like representations of like objects. I just remember in like elementary school, I was really good at drawing Pokemon, and that was like a big pride pride point of mine. And then this like boy moved in who could like draw a better Pikachu than me, and then I was like really competitive. Anyway, so I think like that was part of it, but I think like also drawing like especially like very detailed things like manga or a still life or a watercolor that was very intricate, like that was very much my style in like in grade school all the way up through high school. And looking back, it's like it was a very meditative, but also like a process that required a lot of focus, hyper focus, and it was very calming. And I think like while I was doing it, it felt like um, my mind felt still in a way that it didn't usually, right? Like it was like a sense of flow that I achieved before knowing about flow. And then and okay, so like there was that. And then I think like for the comics, that's something that I used to just like, I would like doodle on the side of my like notebooks, or I would like just like draw a little panda going like you can do it like jayo. Jiayo is like literally add oil. It's a Chinese expression for like, rah rah sispimba, like you can do it. And it's actually just something that I never really thought I would pursue artistically. Um, but it was something like I kind of did on the side, and I would write like, email updates to friends and family, and then I would always like include a little cartoon or whatnot. But actually, like now that I'm more into it, like I've realized that kind of this blend between images, cartoons, and words is really the type of storytelling that fits me the most. And I think like that actually like started to come into being because I was working on actually this like novel. It was like a retelling of a Chinese myth. And like what would happen is like I'd be writing and then I would run into writer's block, and then I would just like switch to like drawing instead. And like that process was very natural and they fed into each other. So I think like that's sort of kind of how I stumbled my way into comics and illustration. And now with like the comic series I have, it's called Panda Cub Stories, and the main character is like me. There's like a little pudgy panda and a hedgehog, and then my two cats, and then John, who appears as a raccoon. That's a long story, but yeah, like it's kind of like become in a way like the panda and the hedgehog and all the characters have taken on their own personalities. And what I realized was that like the panda and the hedgie in the beginning they were all me, right? Like all the actions, all like the tone was exactly the same. And now they've sort of like diverged, and Panda is like the more like impulsive, like hyperactive, like manifestation of myself, and then like the head she is very like prickly and like anxious and like like closes into a little spiky ball like if she's rejected or like something. And so it's actually been really fun playing with the characters and then writing about like things that go on in my life. And in a way, it's allowed me to do like be much kinder to myself because like like we've all done the like why like talking to ourselves like, oh, I can't believe you did that, like why are you such like why are you such an idiot. But like when you're saying that to a cute fuzzy panda like that, I'm like I should probably not be doing that. Like I want to yell less at myself if I'm like a cute fuzzy critter. But yeah.
That's such an amazing outlet to have, and I love that it's kind of become a way for you to express these different sides of you, because I very
Mhm.
much relate to almost having different personalities, like the emotional dysregulation that comes with ADHD and not knowing how to handle it. And I always thought for the longest time that I wasn't a morning person because I was grouchy in the
Yeah.
morning, and I was grouchy because people were talking at me. It was like
Mm-hmm.
there was no wake up time. It was like you woke up and it was you had to be on immediately. And I've come to realize like, no, it's not that I'm not a morning person. It's that I need time to wake up. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's really interesting to me that you get this outlet. Like that's awesome.
Yeah, yeah. And I remember I was like talking to, I don't know if Katie Weber. She hosts another podcast called Women in ADHD, and she was like, "Oh, like I do that, but it's very much like I feel like there's a child version of myself living inside of me, and so like that helps me remember to be like more kind, right? Because like you would never talk to like your best friend or a child the way that you talk to yourself. It like in certain in certain times.
And that's a perfect segue because I use the example like if we were out to dinner and we ordered food and your food came and it was wrong, I would be more
Hmm.
likely to get your food fixed than I would if it were my own because
Yeah.
man, heaven forbid we ever like, stand up for ourselves because there's just a lot of negative connotation that comes with that. And so I'd like to segue that into
Yeah.
food because you have these two kind of life paths that you're on, and food is a big part of it. So tell me how that got started and kind of how that fits into your life as someone who has ADHD and someone who's a creator and someone who is also, very much likes kind of taking care of people.
Yeah, so I feel like the story of my life is like I was doing something and then something like happened on the side and then now it's like one of my main things. So for food, it actually started over the pandemic because so like I'm Sichuanese American. I don't know if you've had like Sichuan cuisine, but it's like known for, the spicy mala flavor profile. Um, and I actually like I started this journey of relearning how to make my family's cuisine over the pandemic for a number of reasons. But basically, like it got to a point where I was like, I know how to make these dishes. I loved cooking with my family growing up. It was like one of the activities that really bonded us together in a family that like didn't really, um, it's like there wasn't a lot of like necessarily like deep personal conversations going on because that was just not part of the family culture, and there was also a lot of like generation divide in hierarchy. But when it came to food, it was like just this very warm communal thing that like all of us loved, right? Like my dad and I could be butting heads over like my college major, but like we would still really love cooking together and eating together. And so basically, like there was all of this, but then I found myself, living alone in New York. And despite like knowing how to make my favorite foods, I would still be spending like hundreds of dollars on takeout every week, or, like I would be eating like cold cereal for a dinner because my like pantry was empty. I had forgotten to go grocery shopping. And there was like just this big divide. And I like, and at this point, like I had already been diagnosed with ADHD. Like I've been living with it for 5 years. But like there I think I was still mentally telling myself the story that like, it was because I was lazy. It was because like I was just like a very, messy person who couldn't get like this part of her life together. And basically like that changed um partly because like I made it a project to learn how to or to document basically how like to make my family's dishes. And it started out kind of like almost as like a part oral history project, and then I was like drawing about it in my comic, which had already established a pretty solid readership at that point. And then I started getting a lot of like feedback from the Panic Hub Stories like readers, and they're like, "Oh, can you talk a little bit more about how your family makes this chili oil? Can you do like a short video tutorial?" And then like that is really sort of like what kickstarted my journey of sharing this more publicly. And kind of long story short, this has now become like a really big leg of my business, because what I realized was, as an ADHDer, like sometimes the things that we struggle with can also be our strengths, right? Like I feel like I'm a little bit like hesitant to be like ADHD is a superpower, because like there are also a lot of like things that we struggle with, right? It's not like, oh, it's great. But I think like, so for example, like one thing that I used to feel very embarrassed about was like there would be a very simple recipe that I knew how to make, but like sometimes I was just like forget steps, right? And so I would always have these like little cheat sheets I would write for myself, and I'm like, I can't believe I need this. Like my mom doesn't need it, or like, but then I realized that like sometimes it's like I need to teach myself how to do something as if I'm the beginner, but like because of that, that actually makes me a very effective instructor for people who are like complete beginners to Sichuan food or complete beginners to cooking. And then that has sort of kind of like impacted my teaching style as like a cooking instructor as well. So yeah, so like a lot of what I share now in terms of me as a cooking instructor is the basics of Sichuan food, because I am Sichuanese, but then also like here are ways to make cooking joyful as someone who's neurodivergent, or someone who's very busy and doesn't have hours and hours to spend in the kitchen. So yeah, it's I'm really kind of grateful that that happened. I actually like I just wrote my first article for today.com, that was published like a couple of days ago, about this. So it's like five techniques I've learned as an ADHDer in the kitchen, and I got to illustrate it, which is really exciting. Thank
Congratulations, that's so exciting.
you. Yeah.
I want to ask you, when you look at life right now, with everything you know about your brain and some of the things that maybe were struggles in the past and the things that you're working on with both your ADHD coach and your business coach, where do you see yourself thriving?
I think two main two main areas of thriving that I think like we already kind of touched on during our conversation, and I think like the first is, ooh, for some reason my mind just got it, but the first is kind of being able to experience everything as a beginner, and then like and because like I really do love learning and teaching, and so I think like the way I learn, especially as an ADHDer, is like I take very like detailed notes and create like very like specific processes to be able to hang on to the things that I've learned, because I think that's one of the biggest things that I struggle with. Like I feel like I've learned something, and then like 2 weeks later it's like nope, all of that is just like gone from my brain. And so while I used to see that as just like this big weakness that I would have to like hide from my colleagues when I was working like in a traditional job, I would have like all of these like secret like workflows that like I would have to refer back to. I was like, I realized that's actually like a really powerful asset. And it's made, for example, like training my assistant that I hired for my business like a lot easier because like I already had these like detailed workflows ready. And then in terms of like, teaching recipes or sharing things with my audience, like the same thing, right? Like this kind of like almost impulse to both hyper focus and also hyper document, but then also like translate those things into something that is like entertaining visually. And so that's how actually like a lot of the drafts of my comics come. And I guess like the second strength is related to that. So I think like a lot of my humor and random like, like visual garnishes come from the fact that a lot of ideas are coming all at once. And sometimes it's like when we're talking right now, it's like all of these like butterflies come flitting into my brain, and then the sentence that I'm saying doesn't make sense anymore. But like when you're drafting a comic, that actually results in like a punchline or like an idea that like blossoms into something like very interesting visually. So yeah, so it's like kind of like those two things are where I see myself thriving.
I want to wrap up by asking you, when we look at ADHD and what the general public knows, keeping in
Mm-hmm.
mind that it's ADHD Awareness Month and the whole goal of all of these interviews is to just highlight how complex it is. What stands out for you as something you wish people either understood better or something that people started to understand?
Yeah, so probably the main thing is kind of like understanding that ADHD means like one of the things means that like we struggle a lot with executive function, and it's not a moral failing, right? It's not like, I forgot your name because I don't care about you, right? Because like I might remember the shirt you were wearing the first time that we met, but like it's like that didn't stick in my mind. And a lot of these things, so it's like I feel like people who either love someone who might have ADHD or someone who has ADHD themselves, I think often there is this story that we either tell ourselves or tell about like the people we know of like they're just not trying hard enough, or they don't care, or like if it was really important to them like it would remember. So kind of like that. But then also on the flip side, I think like, so I guess these are two things, like knowing there are ways to kind of like help them or help yourself. Yeah, I guess like I'm searching for the word, not like fix isn't the word I'm looking for, but um I think it's like one of those things where like ADHD often is an explanation for a lot of things, but it's not necessarily an excuse, right? And so like if there are things that, for example, like are hurting or like disrupting your life, like I think it's very helpful and important to know the reason behind it. But then like like it doesn't mean that we just like need to be like, oh, this is my life now, right? Like and sometimes like that is the case, but like but there are also like strategies that can help you out of it. And I guess like, and of those is like you don't need to do it alone, right? Like yeah. So
That's very great advice. I'm laughing at the "I won't remember your name" comment because I have found that I don't remember a lot of people's names, but I can remember every other detail about you.
yeah,
And so
right.
when I run into people that I haven't seen in a long time, I just em- get the embarrassment out of the way and reintroduce myself right away
Yeah.
because I don't want to assume that they remember my name. And it also then just like clears the air. Like, hey, we know one another and we haven't seen each other in a while, and brains are really hard and complicated. And I'm not wasting energy diving through all those boxes to get there. So I'm just going to
Yeah.
be the one who makes it awkward to begin with.
Love it. Yeah.
Well, Linda, this was such a great conversation. I could keep going. I have so many other things I would love to ask, but I'm going to leave it there for now. I would love to continue the conversation. I would love to get you on Refocus with Lindsay Gensel to talk about food and how you can make being in the kitchen enjoyable and easier for people with ADHD. So let's have a conversation about getting that on the calendar. But in the meantime, thank you for sharing your story with us. I cannot wait to hear about the potty. I'm
Yeah, like now I'm like, oh, that also sounds like another word, but
Yes.
yeah,
No, I
yeah.
got it. I saw the PAW. I appreciated
Yeah,
that.
yeah. Well, yes, it was, I super enjoyed our conversation. Thank you again for having me on.